other people can join in that way. So last week, Jake introduced us to this idea of taking this time to go deeper with God, of getting a reboot. So we want to talk about some of those practices today. Jake, can you just move that? Because I can hear it feeding back to me. I can't seem to turn it off completely. All right. So we're just figuring out some of this technical stuff as well. But today we're going to talk about practicing the presence of God. Have you ever observed a small child in a crowd? Sometimes I notice the kids running through the foyer at church, and I wonder about their perspective. What are they seeing? And I imagine it's just like legs and bodies, but not much else. And that reminds me of Zacchaeus also, who heard that Jesus was in the neighborhood, but couldn't see him because of his short stature. And that feeling of not being able to see over the heads of everyone else is a bit how I've been feeling lately. The relentless news cycle, the growing list of changes to our daily activities, the anxiety about when this will all end and what life will look like when it does, all these can be like that crowd that kept Zacchaeus from seeing Jesus. And like Zacchaeus, we need a different perspective. We need to be able to get above that crowd of thoughts and feelings, news stories, conspiracy theories, social media posts, etc., to get above that crowd in order to recognize that God is fully, really with us, to see him in the midst of this pandemic and its impact on our lives. So as we think about practices that will help us to be aware that we live with God in this time, we need to remember that there is never more available of God to us than right now, in this present moment. There is never more of God available to us than right now. And as we practice tuning into God's presence, we will gain that different perspective and experience his shalom, a sense of well-being, of connectedness to each other and God, of joy and peace. I know that our experiences have been different over the past week or two. Some of your lives have carried on much as normal, still going to work, spending time with your family. Perhaps you've even been getting together with some friends. But others have been laid off of work, feeling isolated at home, maybe concerned about the future. Parents are adjusting to a different reality with expectations of doing schoolwork at home. And if my social media feed is any indication, that hasn't always been the easiest thing. I don't know if we can be thankful that this week is spring break. And many of you are learning how to work from home, and you're picking up new skills in technology, as you are just going to church this morning. Well, that's where I found myself this past week, teaching my classes live online, figuring out how to do class discussions, how to show videos, even participating in chapels. So in some ways, life carries on almost like normal. And yet, I've also felt a kind of a disorientation, feeling off kilter spiritually. It's been hard for me to put my finger on. When I think about it, it almost seems like I know how to be with God and to practice his presence in the ordinary circumstances of life. But how do I do it now? How do I relate to a God who sits above this messy planet, who observes the global chaos, and yet I also believe is interested in each of our lives? It feels different somehow, and I wonder, what is he thinking? So when I was thinking about that, I thought about Job and how the disorientation he experienced in the midst of the chaos wreaked in his life. And he poured out lots of lament and just like trying to figure it all out in his conversation with God. And eventually God spoke, reminding him that God was bigger than it all And this seemed to satisfy Job. But for me, this fact seems to be the sticking point, that God seems so remote. So how can we experience Emmanuel, God with us, at this time? Well, let's go back to that story. Let's jump in a boat with the disciples. And there are two stories like this in the Gospels of the disciples out in a storm on Lake Galilee, straining against the wind, waves threatening to swamp their boat. We heard the first one read and told, but I want to focus on the second one from Matthew chapter 14, starting at verse 22 and following. The second story parallels our situation in some ways. We've been sent off on our own. Jesus is not physically present with us. He stays behind. But we know the stories of how he's been with us in the past. And he's staying behind to pray. Is he praying for us? We're out on the lake at night and the wind has picked up. At about 3 a.m, we're pulling for all our might at the oars when we see this ghostly figure coming towards us, disappearing from view behind a huge wave and then visible again, coming towards us on top of the water. We cry out in fear and the figure speaks. Take heart, it is I. While Jesus could simply be saying, hey guys, it's me, don't worry. The way it's phrased, ego eimi in the Greek, also reminds us of God's self-designation in the Old Testament. It's the name God gave himself, ego eimi, I am, Yahweh. Psalm 77 verse 19 says, your way was through the sea, your path through the mighty waters, yet your footprints were unseen. So just as I am treads the waters, leading the people of Israel through the sea, so does Jesus. In his commentary, Michael Green says, Jesus has been praying for us and he will come to us walking on the storm. When we trust him, he'll enable us to do the impossible. Peter, with his eyes on Jesus, took a huge step of faith. Leon Morris observes that what happened to Peter next is what happens to so many of us. Peter shifted his concentration from Jesus, who could enable him to overcome difficulties, to the difficulties in which he found himself. And the result was disastrous. What's threatening you right now in the waves around you? Death, insecurity, unbelief, unemployment, sickness, guilt, loneliness. When our eyes shift from Jesus to the wind and waves, we are overpowered. Peter begins with faith, responding to Jesus' presence. But then he notices the wind and fear grasps him and the waves overpower again. But he cries out. It might be little faith, as Jesus calls it, but it is faith. The cry of doubt, of lament, of desperation is a word expressed to the God who we believe could do something. And so it is a cry of faith. And Jesus reaches out with his firm grasp and pulls Peter to safety. Jake, do you by any chance have that picture that I sent you? I was going to show a picture here of a stained glass window that is in City Church in Winnipeg. Back in 2008, when we first moved to Winnipeg, we were just checking out different churches throughout the summer. And one Sunday we went to City Church. And I was kind of a year and a bit out of a spiritual crisis that had really shaken me, where, my eyes on the waves had almost taken me down. And I was sitting in that worship service and just looking at this stained glass window and the embrace of Peter, Jesus embracing him. Do you have it there? Okay, great. I hope you can see that, because to me that was just so beautiful, of Jesus reaching out, and saying, yeah, you have little faith, but hey, I've got you. Don't worry. And I felt held in that embrace of Jesus, pulled to safety. In some ways, Peter failed in this story, but despite that lapse of faith, God was with him. I'm sure Peter remembered this story and retold it often. It would have become for him a way to return to the presence of God as he sought to lead the church through trying times in the following decades. And probably as people were, stressed by what they saw happening around them, persecution, difficulty, Peter would have said, hey, but guys, remember that story I told you? Remember how Jesus was present with me in that storm? This is one of the ways we too can practice the presence of Emmanuel, of God with us. In times of no shalom, remembering experiences of God's presence in the past can be a first step to recognizing his presence in this current situation. So remembering and expressing appreciation brings us back to a place of shalom, of feeling well with God. And in that frame of mind, we can once again be aware of God's presence, and then can invite him to help us see our current circumstances through his eyes. So instead of beating yourself up or getting frustrated with a family member who's not living aware of God's presence, take time to remember together experiences and things that you have appreciated about God. Jake has previously shared how we began to do this on our sabbatical last year. At the end of each day, we'd sit together and share 3 things. First, something we had enjoyed from our day. Secondly, something we appreciated about a person. And often that was about each other, because we were the only people we were seeing many days. And third, it was some aspect of God's character for which we were thankful. So 3 things. Something we enjoyed in our day, something we appreciated about someone else, and some aspect of God's character for which we were thankful. Perhaps such a 1 + 1 + 1 practice could become a new family ritual during this time of enforced closeness, or something you do on the phone with a friend or a family member at the end of the day. Some of you have shared how you're limiting your news intake and increasing your worship intake in order to keep things in the right perspective. And this is another way of practicing God's presence. A final practice that's been helping me is to slow down, to breathe deeply, and in that breath, simply to pray this prayer: breath of life, I give you thanks. And on the inhale, I'm breathing in life, breath of life, and I'm exhaling, thanks, life, thanks. It's a simple prayer, and one that can almost run in the back of my mind while I go about other tasks. And it reminds me that I draw every breath from God, and all thanks is due him. Seems an appropriate prayer for this time. There is never more of God available to us than right now, in this present moment. Remembering this might take more strength these days. Sarah Colin suggests that it may be like adding heavier weights to your workout routine. She says a more strenuous workout leads to stronger muscles, so let us take heart. We may fail at times, but when we realize we've forgotten God, that's our chance to begin again, thanking God for his grace. There is grace for even this. And it's okay to remind each other of that as well. I did that for Jake the other day. Just said, hey, there's grace for even this. There's grace for this day where you felt like you didn't live as fully in the presence of God as you wished you would have. There is grace. As we practice tuning into God's presence, we will gain that above the crowd perspective and experience God's shalom, a sense of well-being, of connectedness to God and each other, of joy and peace. Colossians 3:15 sums this up. Let the peace of Christ rule in all of your hearts, to which indeed you were called in the one body together, and be thankful. Amen.